You're being dramatic, Elena. I'm at a gallery opening, and I can't just walk out because you had a fender bender. My mother's voice was as smooth as the silk gown she was wearing, completely drowning out the scream of the sirens in my ear. I wasn't having a fender bender. I was being cut out of my crumpled Toyota by 3 firefighters while a paramedic held an oxygen mask to my face. My pelvis was fractured in 2 places, and my 6-week-old daughter, Maya, was at home with a neighbor who barely knew her name. "Mom," I wheezed, the pain in my chest feeling like hot glass. "I'm going into surgery. Maya needs you. David is stuck in Chicago." "Then call a sitter," she snapped. "Your sister Vanessa never has these emergencies. Honestly, your lack of planning is not my crisis." I looked at the clock on the ambulance dashboard. 6:14 p.m. In that moment, something inside me went colder than the IV fluids entering my arm. My mother didn't know that for the last 9 years, I had been the silent ghost paying her $4,800 monthly mortgage. By tomorrow morning, that ghost was going to vanish. Before we get into the plan I executed from that hospital bed, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment below. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? I read every single one of your comments and love seeing our community grow. The world didn't end with a bang. It ended with the smell of scorched rubber and the rhythmic ticking of my shattered engine. I watched, through a haze of smoke, as the delivery truck that had T-boned me idled 50 yards away, its driver slumped over the wheel. My first thought wasn't the searing fire in my hip. It was Maya. She was 6 weeks old, her tiny lungs accustomed only to the scent of my skin. I had only intended to be gone for 15 minutes, a quick dash to the pharmacy for nursing pads, while my 78-year-old neighbor, Mrs. Gable, watched her sleep. Mrs. Gable was kind, but she moved with a walker and had clearly stated she couldn't manage a crying infant for more than a few minutes. "She won't eat," I choked out as the paramedic strapped me onto the gurney. "She won't take a bottle. She needs me." The paramedic, a woman named Sarah, with calloused hands and a steady gaze, didn't look away. "We're going to get you stable, honey. Focus on your breathing." But how could I breathe, knowing my daughter was waking up to a world where I was missing, and the one woman who was supposed to be my safety net had just hung up on me to look at oil paintings? This wasn't the first time my mother had diagnosed my life as a performance. In her eyes, I wasn't her daughter. I was a series of inconveniences wrapped in exaggeration. When I was 22 and doubled over with what turned out to be acute gallstones, she'd stood over my bed and told me to take an antacid and stop seeking attention. When I had a fever of 103 from bronchitis, she'd suggested I was just burnt out from my little job and needed to toughen up. The standard was always different for my sister Vanessa. Vanessa was the saint of the family. She has 3 children, a house in the suburbs, and a lifestyle that my mother curated like a museum exhibit. Vanessa didn't have emergencies. She had life events that required the entire family's attendance. If Vanessa's toddler had a sniffle, my mother would drive 3 hours with homemade soup. But when I was being loaded into an ambulance with a fractured pelvis, I was simply being difficult. "Vanessa has 3 kids and she never manages to get hit by trucks, Elena." My mother's voice echoed in my head, sharp and condescending. "She's a planner. You've always been so fragile, always needing someone to pull you out of the mud." I stared at the lock screen on my phone. It was a photo from my baby shower 4 months ago. My mother was beaming, her arm around my shoulders, looking like the picture of maternal devotion for my Instagram feed. I remember how she'd whispered to me right after the photo was taken, Make sure you tag the florist. I don't want people thinking we went cheap on the centerpieces. She didn't love me. She loved the image of a successful daughter, and Vanessa provided that image for free. I, on the other hand, had been paying for it in cash for nearly a decade, thinking that if I solved all their problems, they would finally see me. I was a fool who believed that $500,000 could buy a seat at the table where I was already the one paying for the meal. For years, I had operated under the grandchild delusion, the desperate hope that once my mother held Maya, the icy barriers of her narcissism would melt into grandmotherly warmth. But lying on that hospital gurney, I finally saw the truth. A person who views their own child as an inconvenience will only view their grandchild as a prop. When the paramedic handed me my phone to find a backup, I didn't call another relative. I didn't call a friend who would offer thoughts and prayers. I called Starlight Concierge Nursing. A woman named Julianne answered. Within seconds, she had mobilized a registered nurse named Serafina to head to my house. There was no lecture on my lack of organization, no sigh of annoyance, just professional, immediate grace. "We have her, Elena," Julianne said. "Focus on your surgery. Serafina will coordinate with the hospital for your milk. Your daughter is safe." The cost was $85 an hour with a premium emergency surcharge. It was expensive, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't paying for a maybe. I was paying for a certainty. I realized then that I had spent nearly $500,000 trying to rent my mother's love. And yet a stranger on the phone gave me more peace of mind for $85. The psychological weight of a decade's worth of debt I felt I owed my parents suddenly felt feather light. If I was going to be alone and chaotic in my mother's eyes regardless of what I did, I might as well stop paying for the privilege of being insulted. The morphine was beginning to blur the edges of the hospital room, but it couldn't numb the sting of the text message that flashed on my screen an hour later. It wasn't an apology. It was a link to a TikTok my sister had just posted. "Pre-cruise glow up with the best mom in the world!" I could hear the echoes of our earlier call. To my mother, my fractured pelvis was just another Elena episode. She'd told the nurses, when they called her as my emergency contact, that I was likely exaggerating for David's attention. "She's always had a flair for the dramatic," she'd told the head nurse. "Remember her college graduation? She fainted from the heat just to get out of the photos. It was just a little dehydration, but she acted like she was on her deathbed." But the true breaking point came when my grandfather Joe arrived. He looked like he'd aged a decade in the hour since he'd heard the news. He sat by my bed, his knuckles white as he gripped his cane. "I called her, Elena," he whispered, his voice trembling with a rage I'd never seen. "I told her you were in surgery. Do you know what she said?" She said, "Maya isn't my responsibility. Elena made the life choice to have a child, and now she has to own the reality of that choice. We have a suite booked on that ship, Dad. I'm not throwing away 8 months of planning for a hospital visit that'll be over by morning." A life choice. My daughter, the innocent 6-week-old baby currently being held by a hired nurse because her own grandmother couldn't be bothered, was a life choice to be managed. That was the moment the last thread of my daughterly loyalty snapped. I wasn't a daughter anymore. I was a creditor, and it was time to collect. The nurse had dimmed the lights, thinking I was drifting off to sleep. Instead, the blue light of my smartphone illuminated my face like a cold, digital mask. My thumb hovered over my banking portal. For 9 years, I had maintained a ghost account, a relic of my 20-year-old self who wanted to save her parents from losing their home after my father's early retirement debacle. I opened the recurring transfers folder. There it was. Project Charity. Every month, like clockwork, $4,800 left my earnings. I had routed it through a secondary LLC I'd formed for my consulting work, so their bank statements wouldn't show my name. My mother, ever the narcissist, had convinced my father it was vested dividends from a distant relative's estate she'd conveniently forgotten about. They never questioned the miracle. They just spent it. I pulled up the calculator app. $4,800 multiplied by 112 months. $537,600. Over $500,000. That was the price of the life choices I had funded for them. That money had paid for their mahogany back deck, my father's vintage car collection, and the very cruise they were currently packing for. It had funded Vanessa's down payment and her children's private preschools. I looked at my bruised reflection in the darkened screen. I had been paying $500,000 for the privilege of being called dramatic while I lay in a hospital bed. I had been subsidizing the very people who viewed my daughter as a consequence. There was no anger left, only a frigid, mathematical certainty. If they wanted me to own my reality and be independent, I was more than happy to oblige. But independence is a two-way street. If I was responsible for my own crises, they were now officially responsible for their own mortgage. I didn't hesitate. I tapped the Deactivate Recurring Transfer button. The screen flashed a confirmation. Action complete. The bank's interface asked if I wanted to redirect the $4,800 to an existing internal account. I paused. Sending it back into my own checking felt like reclaiming a debt. But I didn't want this money to be about the past anymore. I wanted it to be a shield. With a few precise taps, I opened a high-yield trust account. I named it Maya's Legacy. I set the new recurring transfer to trigger on the 1st of every month, the exact same day my mother's mortgage used to be settled. For nearly a decade, that money had bought me nothing but insults and seaweed wraps for a woman who didn't care if I lived or died. From now on, it would buy my daughter's education, her first home, and a life where she would never have to beg a narcissist for a moment of their time. I hit confirm. A young resident doctor, Dr. Eris, stepped into the room to adjust my IV drip. He paused, looking at the monitors and then at me. "Your heart rate has actually stabilized, Elena. You looked like you were in a hypertensive crisis 10 minutes ago. Whatever you just did, keep doing it." I leaned back against the stiff hospital pillows, a strange, cooling sensation washing over my chest. The physical pain in my pelvis was still there, sharp and demanding, but the suffocating weight of my mother's expectations had vanished. "I just stopped funding a fantasy, doctor," I said, my voice finally steady. He smiled, though he looked a bit confused. "Well, your vitals love it. The color is coming back to your skin. You're looking less like a victim and more like a survivor." I wasn't just a survivor. I was the person who held the keys to the kingdom my parents had been living in. For years, I'd stayed silent because I was afraid they'd stop loving me if the money stopped. Lying in that bed, I realized they never loved me to begin with. They just loved the lifestyle I provided. And since the love was already gone, there was no reason to keep paying the bill. Grandpa Joe didn't just sit by my bed. He went to war. When I told him the exact figure, Over $500,000 funneled into my parents' bank accounts while they treated me like a nuisance. His face turned a shade of granite I'd never seen. "They're at a gallery opening tonight," Joe said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Celebrating your mother's 55th birthday before their Platinum Suite cruise departs tomorrow. A trip I paid $14,000 for." He didn't hesitate. He pulled out his phone and dialed the cruise line's concierge. I watched, stunned, as he bypassed the automated system and reached a supervisor. "This is Joseph Sterling. I'm the primary cardholder for booking 77 Alpha. Cancel it. All of it. No, I don't want a credit. Issue the refund to my card immediately. My daughter and son-in-law will not be boarding that ship." He hung up and looked at me, his eyes softening only for a second. "Your grandmother always warned me that Patricia had a hollow heart. I didn't want to believe it. I thought if I provided enough for her, she'd have enough room to love you. I was wrong." Then he made the call that ended the era of my mother's golden life. He called her while she was likely sipping Prosecco. "Patricia," he said, not waiting for a greeting. "I know about the $500,000 Elena has paid for your mortgage. I know she's been carrying you for a decade. And I know you left her in a trauma ward to go look at paintings. The cruise is gone. The inheritance is next. I'm meeting my lawyer at 9 a.m. to sign the deed for the Pasadena house over to a trust for Maya. You have 24 hours to show me you're a mother, or you can find a new place to live." The peace of my recovery lasted exactly until Vanessa's name lit up my screen at midnight. I didn't even have to say hello before her voice shrieked through the speaker. "What is wrong with you, Elena? Mom is in tears. You've manipulated Grandpa into canceling their trip and threatening their home, all because you had a minor scrap while you were distracted behind the wheel? You're being incredibly vindictive." "A minor scrap?" I looked down at the surgical staples in my hip. "I was T-boned by a semi-truck, Vanessa. I had internal bleeding. And while I was terrified for my life, Mom told me my lack of planning wasn't her crisis." "She was stressed," Vanessa countered. "And then you lie to her about the mortgage, telling her you've been paying it? That's low, even for you." We all know that money comes from great Uncle Arthur's estate. I felt a cold, sharp laugh bubble up in my throat. "Vanessa, check the routing numbers. Check with Grandpa. There is no Arthur estate. There's just my consulting firm, which has been subsidizing your life, your kids' school, and Mom's seaweed wraps for 9 years. I've spent over $500,000 on this family, and I couldn't even get 3 hours of childcare in return." Silence. It was the first time in my life I had ever rendered my sister speechless. "Wait," she stammered, her voice losing its edge. You were the one? But Mom said—" "Mom lied to you the same way she lied to me," I interrupted. "But the bank doesn't lie. The payments are dead, Vanessa. If you want Mom to keep her house, I suggest you start writing the checks yourself, since you're the perfect daughter. I'm sure you've got $4,800 a month to spare." "Elena, wait, we can't—" "I'm done being the family ATM," I said, my thumb hovering over the red button. "And I'm done being the villain in a story I'm paying for. Goodbye, Vanessa." I blocked her. 10 minutes later, my mother tried to call. I blocked her too. The 24-hour deadline for an apology came and went. The silence was the loudest, most honest thing she had ever given me. 18 months later, the golden life has officially tarnished. My parents were forced to sell the Pasadena house and are now living in a 2-bedroom rental. My mother, who hadn't worked a real day in a decade, is now a floor manager at a department store. A reality she describes to anyone who will listen as a tragic fall. Vanessa's marriage is buckling under the weight of my mother's new financial demands. She recently had to refinance her own home just to keep Mom's creditors at bay. I feel no malice toward them, but I feel no pity either. I simply stopped being the floor they walked on, and they found out just how hard the ground really is. Maya is 2 years old now. She doesn't know about the woman who called her a life choice or a consequence. She only knows the warmth of her father's arms, the kindness of David's parents who flew in from Arizona without being asked, and the stories Grandpa Joe tells her every Sunday afternoon. She is growing up in a world where family isn't a transaction, it's a foundation. That $4,800 a month now flows into a trust that will ensure Maya never has to choose between her dignity and her security. By the time she's 18, that account, fueled by the money I once used to buy my mother's silence, will be $1 million shield for her future. I used to think I was paying for love. I realize now I was just paying a ransom for a relationship that was already dead. If there is one thing I've learned from that crumpled Toyota and the cold silence of a hospital room, it's this. Stop trying to earn love from people who only value you for your utility. When someone shows you they are willing to let you suffer because it's inconvenient for them, believe them the first time. Your peace is worth more than their approval. If this story resonated with you, or if you've ever had to set a hard boundary to protect your own peace, hit that like button. Drop a comment and tell me, when was the moment you finally chose yourself over a toxic situation? I'd love to read your stories. And don't forget to subscribe. We share stories of strength and strategic moves every single week, and I want you to be part of our community.